Welcome to Just Read It. I'm Caroline Miller, your host for our book talk show, where I meet with local artists who are here to talk about New York Times bestsellers. And the book we'll be discussing today is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Pretty dense book. I think you're going to enjoy the discussion. And I have two guests with me. Dale Hess, a former professor of political science who has a blog, and I'll let him speak to that in a minute. And then Susan Tweit, who is a botanist, a writer, and much to say. So let's begin on this momentous book, which isn't very large, but is just stuffed with ideas. So let me begin again with you, Dale. Tell us a little bit about your blog and what your blog address is and your blog site.
Well, my blog is called The Dilettante's Dilemma. I'm the dilettante. My training's in political psychology. So which is a subfield of political science, which you correctly identified my discipline. But political psychology means that I'm pushed off into as many directions as we think about how power is shared. So that's mostly what I write about.
Okay, that's going to be appropriate to today's topic.
It certainly is.
And Susan, a little bit of background. And Susan, you have a new book. I wonder if you tell us a little something about that.
I do have a new book out. Thank you, Caroline. It's my 13th. It's a memoir called Bless the Birds, Living with Love in a Time of Dying. And the story is a personal one about the journey my late husband and I took with his brain cancer. But really the theme of the book is about how we can rise and why we would want to rise to our best selves in the hardest times we can imagine, whether those times are dealing with the grief of global climate change or more personal tragedies or coping with Black Lives Matter and the racism in this country, or any other really difficult time when we feel despairing about the world. How do we be our best selves? How do we live those times with love? So that's what the book is about. And it's actually, I think of it as a love story and a journey story, even though it does have a sad ending. And I am a botanist, and I've been a freelance writer for 35 years. I've written for national magazines and newspapers, 13 books, nature, memoir, travel, kids, gardening. My passion, my ministry, as it were, is reconnecting people with nature. So Piranesi fascinates me because of the imaginary world it involves and the way we escape from the world we inhabit and what we do with where we find ourselves. So,
well, that's a great introduction.
You sound good.
Go on or getting Dale's reaction. Dale, you have a sense of can you take us a little farther with Susan's remarks about the book?
Well, Susan has talked about about nature. I don't see Piranesi as surrounded by nature, although of course he is. I see him surrounded by culture. This is a culture which has flowed out of our world and into another place, and it hasn't dissipated. It's taken a form, and he lives inside that form in a way that is amazingly concrete. So I'm eager. I haven't found anybody to talk to about this book. So I've been looking forward to today, Susan, for a long time.
Well, Susan, I want you to go right ahead. But I'm going to say, let me just throw in a third one. It seems to me that culture and ethics and religion. Okay, I'll throw that into the mix. Susan, what's your response to Dale?
Well, every chapter or every daily entry in Piranesi's journal is the year the albatross came into the world he lives in.
Right.
And there's a good bit of, I mean, the tides govern his life. He has learned to forage for the seaweeds and the mussels and the fish that come into this crazy labyrinth of halls where he lives, halls full of statuary of humans, but also other species too. There's the gorilla, there's the bees, there's all sorts of other species. So it's a very interesting imaginary world, although not quite imaginary. He's found himself in an alternate reality that is governed by night and day and tides and the moon and the stars and the appearance of albatrosses, the birds he talks to, just totally full of natural kinds of references. His life is enmeshed in nature inside this labyrinth of halls full of statuary, which are allegorical, it seems to me. So I find it a fascinating mishmash of a reality that doesn't fit our current world at all, but has so many references to the things we are attuned to or not attuned to in our daily lives.
But Dale, as you say, there is this natural world, but there is the cultural aspect. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah, I'd like to. Just to go back to Susan's reference to the calendar, one of the things that occurred to me this afternoon, and I got the book and checked it, when he shifts out, he leaves the labyrinth and goes to live in the world that we live in, he changes the dating.
Yes, he does.
So it's November 26th, 2018. That's the first date that he records, as opposed to the first day of the fifth month after the albatrosses came to the Southwestern Hall.
Yes.
All of the book, until that very, very last one, the November one, are by his own calendar.
Yes.
And yet, as Susan says, he follows the lunar calendar. So he's completely at home where he is. Now, one of the previous people who visited had no idea how to take care of himself. He was starving.
Yes.
They lose their memory right away, and they don't become competent in the area where they were. He did.
Yes.
It was it's like somebody was dropped out in the bush somewhere and learns the ways of the bush so fast that he's not eaten by the wild animals, and he learns how to feed himself.
Yes.
Well, let's stop there so that in case our readers or watchers haven't read the book, and this is a man who suddenly finds himself, or we find him in a world to which he's well adapted, but which is very magical and strange and yet full of hints of our world. So he is making his own, again, Dale, his culture, his own religion, his own ethics, and he's alone except for a couple of other people. One is the other, to whom he sometimes meets, and the other, and I'll just throw this in, is after knowledge. But Piranesi seems to not have much faith in knowledge. You want to pick up on that, either one of you?
Well, yes. He is being very dutiful in following Dr. Ketterly's instructions. But very early in the story, he loses faith in the idea that there is a true and secret knowledge in there anywhere. He continues to do the things he's being asked to do, which is an interesting choice. But he himself doesn't expect to find secret knowledge. And because the house is bountiful and gracious, I want to ask Susan about that phrase. The house is bountiful and gracious. He lives like a favored child.
So we should back up and say that this is a fantasy with a mystery in it. We are plunked into the story through Piranesi's journal. He keeps a daily journal, and in it, which is written in the first person, and in it he chronicles what he's done that day. And his assignment from the other, the man he knows only as the other at that point, is to map this labyrinth of thousands of halls. And they're halls in the classical sense. They are huge rectangular spaces that Susanna Clarke brings alive beautifully. She describes them without too much description. She doesn't slow down the story, but she describes the statuary, what level they're at. And Piranesi has spent his days exploring, and because this is a British book, many kilometers deep into this labyrinth, but there are many, many more halls to discover. So the mystery is who he is, how he got there, and who this other is and what he really wants. And Piranesi has been going along as if the other, who is his only human companion, who he meets with, once a week? I'm trying to remember, once or twice a week?
Twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays.
Twice a week. He meets with the other twice a week, but as far as he knows, he's the only other human in the world. This labyrinth is Piranesi's world. It's the only one he knows. And the only other humans he knows of are the bones he's found, and that he carefully secretes safely out of the reach of the tides that come crashing through the halls and inundate everything. He carefully secretes them, and he takes them food, and he speaks to them fondly, and he, if they get disarranged by the tides, he rearranges them. And, he's a loving caretaker of this world and has adopted it as his own. It's amazing how he doesn't struggle, fight, or if he did, we don't know that in this book. Absolutely. As you said, Dale, and that's a quote from Piranesi, the house is gracious and beneficent to him, and this world he lives in, and he believes that. What he doesn't believe, it turns out, is the good faith of the other, who positions himself as his teacher.
This is such a complex book. Dale, as you say, Susan, it's a small book that is like E equals MC squared. It says, but Dale, now it seems to me that this book, and I'd like you to comment, touches on, as I've said, the cultural aspect of man, the religious aspect of man, and the science of man. Did you get a sense out of this book that that's true, for one? And B, do we have a sense as we go through the book that Piranesi comes to prefer one above the other three?
Well, he melds them in a really remarkable way. If I were going to recommend this, well, I have recommended the book. A book group that I'm a part of has chosen to read this book, and I'm looking forward to that discussion too. But I think they chose it because I recommended that they read it in two ways. First, you read it from front to back, page by page by page, and you meet Piranesi in the way Susanna Clarke wants us to meet Piranesi. And then, if you want to, I did this, you go back and read it in actual time order. Mm-hmm. What's the first thing we know that happened? What's the second thing we know that happened? Mm-hmm. And I see Susan nodding. Those two chronologies are completely unlike.
Yes.
They don't come together until the very, very end, when he leaves the caverns and the two halves of his life are together in a sense. He's scientific in that he understands the tides. He's very, very cultural in the sense that he knows what these sculptures represent.
Yes.
But he also carries the meanings of the sculptures with him when he goes outside. Just this afternoon, just to remind myself, I read of his walking through the park. This is the last scene. He walks through the park and he sees an old man, weather beaten, and in the park, and he realizes that he knows him. That's what he says.
He's one of the kings. He's the statue of the king, the wise king, holding the globe in his hand. Yeah.
Exactly. And he wants to tell the old man, in another world, you're a wise and wealthy king.
Yes.
But he doesn't. And then he sees a woman with a couple of small children, and he realizes he knows them too. Well, when he says, I know them, he's locating them in the marble mythology in which he's been living.
The allegory.
Exactly. Exactly. He's been living in an allegory, and now he recognizes the people.
Well, Susan, can you pick that up? This notion of, this is what I might have called religion, the need to build a myth to justify, to make sense of our world. Can you speak to that at all? Or?
I think what I found so fascinating about the world Susanna Clarke created for Piranesi, this beyond the current reality world, is the allegorical nature of the statuary, and I would say that's the culture part. That each statue represents some facet of human behavior, human types, and the religion, the spiritual part, really seemed to me his wonder at the other inhabitants of the house, this labyrinth of halls, and his ability to talk to the birds, talk with them, to learn from their behavior. He's in one scene, he talks about how the flock of small birds he's watching in a hall of statuary divides, and they fly to this statue first, and he says, all right, what does that mean? What are they saying to me by flying to this statue? And then they fly to another statue, and he says, all right, now they're saying this. And he puts that together in a way that they are giving him a message. He has this amazing spiritual connection to the bones of the other humans he finds and to the living beings he finds around him. It's just a sort of, it's a story of innocence, in a sense, in that he's thrown into a world where he is the only human and has to make other than the other, and has to make his own culture and spirituality and collect data about how that world behaves. He's a mathematician. He models the tides. So
Susan, let me ask you a question about that. I had forgotten the scene where the birds fly from one place to another, and you've reminded me of it now. My recollection is that he concluded that the birds were not actually saying anything to him. Is that the way you remember?
He came up with a coherent warning they were giving him.
Did he?
And
okay.
It turns out, and it guided him. So he really did. He really took them as omens or oracles, in a sense. And there's a spiritual component to that. You know, his relationship to the world is partly magical realism, and I think the house represents a kind of return to innocence. And when he returns to the real world, the actual world where we all live, as Matthew Rose, and I forget his last name, and he sort of reluctantly inhabits that existence, he keeps his ability to go back to the house as a way to buffer him from the demands of the real world. That's his retreat, his refuge. And it's also the refuge of the woman who finds him, the police officer. She finds it very much a refuge.
Let me ask you both a question then, because I agree, he is the innocent. Do you see him, either viewer, as a tragic figure? I mean, he gets saved, if you will, from this world, but is not happy in the world to which he truly belongs. And so there is that thread, and he goes back, Paradise Lost. Do you, either of you, see him as a tragic character?
I don't have any way at all to see him as tragic. I think he's remarkably resilient. And I think possibly I differ a little bit from the two of you. Let me read you the last sentence in the book. The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And he's talking about the world that we live in.
No. He is talking about the house. He says that twice in the book. Dale, you have to go back earlier in the book. He says that twice in the book. He's talking about the labyrinth. The beauty of the house is immeasurable. He says that earlier when he is living in the labyrinth. He's not talking about the world we live in.
Well, he is not talking about the world that we live in when he says it earlier. But I think he is talking about the world that we live in when he says it that last time.
I would disagree. Partly because he
Okay,
talks about
I got to bring this to a close, but it's a terrible thing to do at this point. But let me ask each of you, what does the house represent to each of you?
Susan, want to try it?
I think you should go first, Dale.
Okay.
Put your foot in it, Dale.
He attributes intentionality to the world that he lives in. And that means to the statues, to, well, not the tides, but to all the human figures and all the birds and all the everything. They have meaning for him. And when he's beginning to think, oh dear, am I Matthew Rose Sorensen? Am I Piranesi? What is going on here? He goes to the statue of the gorilla for comfort, and he is comforted. He receives comfort from the gorilla. So I don't see him as a tragic figure at all. He has remarkable resilience, and his emotional ability to reach out and to connect with the surroundings is absolutely admirable. He's a marvelous person.
He's extraordinary. I would agree with that. The house, to me, the labyrinth that he finds himself in represents, I think, it's magical realism. It represents what Piranesi wants it to be. He even attributes intention to the kayak that the other, or Dr. what's his name, brings into the world. That kayak comes toward him, dances with him, and then ultimately rejects him. And Piranesi describes it when he finds the kayak later as lying passively, as if it has never, never, been involved in this relationship with the other. So for me, that world is a world of the richness of, I think, the animate universe. And Piranesi, Matthew Rose Sorensen, is getting in touch with the inner self that is essentially in oneness with all of those other lives. So for me, it's a very deeply spiritual, very deeply animism kind of world.
For him, it's almost like the outer world and the inner world are really the same world.
Yes.
Well, let me just put in my pitch for tragedy here, because, Oedipus was resilient, but he was certainly tragic. It seems to me that human beings are torn between a number of worlds and a number of associations, and choosing how to make our life full of good intention is a big problem. But go ahead, I give you 5 seconds to rebut me, Dale.
Well, I don't think I can do it in 5 seconds.
That's why you only got 5.
I hope I will have a longer time after the program.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've watched this program, you will know this is a book you simply cannot afford to overlook. So Piranesi, highly, highly recommended. I presume, now let me say, Susan, would you recommend this book?
I have already suggested to several people that they read it. Absolutely. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. It's not an easy one.
I have as well.
Easy doesn't equal necessarily rich and deep, and this is a rich and deep book.
This is a rich and deep book, that is for sure. Well, we must bring things to a close. Dale, I'm going to ask you to please give us the name of your blog one more time.
My blog is called The Dilettante's Dilemma.
And where we find it at?
Just go online and type in thedilettantesdilemma.com and I will come up.
If we can spell dilettante, but okay. And
1 L, 2 T's.
Susan, please, your book, and I want to offer my condolences, because The loss is fairly recent.
There we go. Bless the Birds.
Bless the Birds, Living with Love in a Time of Dying. It's a memoir. Again, it's about really how to be our best selves when the times are worst, and why we would want to be. You know, we don't always make that choice, but life is for living, and living it with love beats the heck out of living it any other way, no matter how difficult it is.
Sounds
And
great.
I think Piranesi would agree with that, don't you all?
Absolutely.
Listen, thank you, my very wonderful and thoughtful guest. My little gray cells are just spinning as a result of today's conversation. I want to thank you again, Dale and Susan, for being with us. And I want to thank our audience. We publish every 2 months. You might want to consider subscribing. We don't sell your name, we don't sell advertising, but please make sure to come back and join us next time for Just Read It.